It's important to be part of a union because you have to have a voice.
Welcome to Union Talk. I'm Randi Weingarten. And today, we're talking about an issue that has been in the headlines repeatedly over the last few months, particularly if you listen to Fox Radio or watch Fox TV. It's fueled fierce debate. There's been conflict at school board meetings. It's resulted in laws all across the country about what teachers can teach. And it's even been blamed in part for Terry McAuliffe's loss in Virginia. And we're talking about something that's not even taught in most K through 12 classrooms across the country. But it is an example of how an ideological movement, here the right wing, has used a phrase to try and drive a wedge between parents and educators and schools. And what I'm talking about is the phrase critical race theory. I'll give you an example. One of the people who has pushed this ideology and has pushed to try to make this phrase toxic is a guy by the name of Christopher Rufo. And this is what he said about it this past March in a tweet. And I quote, "We have successfully frozen their brand, quote, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to enact the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans." Why do I quote him? Because ultimately, we know that he and others are trying to actually create a wedge between parents and educators and schools at the very same time as in the aftermath of COVID, even though we're not quite over COVID, we need to bring parents and teachers together to help our kids recover and to create a safe and welcoming environment. So today, we're joined by two very distinguished guests who will pull back the curtain to discuss what these attacks are really about and what students need to know to be fully productive citizens in our society, what we need to do to prepare our kids for life, for civic engagement, for career, for college. And let me just be really clear before I introduce our guests. Our public schools don't teach CRT. But what our public schools do is that they teach honest history. They teach and should teach a way for our kids to learn about the past, to chart a path for the future that lives up to the American ideals of justice for all, and that creates an opportunity for kids to really understand the good and the bad of American history and of America. So I can't wait to talk to these two experts and share them with you. First is Dr. Marcia Chatelain, who is a professor of history and African American studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Previously, she was a Reach for Excellence assistant professor of honors and African American studies at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma. Dr. Chatelain is a scholar of African American life and of African American culture. Her first book, Southside's Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration, reimagined the mass exodus of Black Southerners to the urban North from the perspective of girls and teenage women. And her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, examines the intersection of the post-1968 civil rights struggle and the rise of the fast food industry. So glad to have you with us, Dr. Chatelain. And our second guest is Peter Levine, who is the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and the Lincoln Filing Professor of Citizenship and Public Affairs in Tufts University's Jonathan Tisch College of Civic Life. Peter is trained as a moral and political philosopher, and he has spent most of his career conducting applied empirical research and organizing professional efforts related to civic life in the United States, including, and this is where I got to know Peter, work on civic education, voting rights, public deliberation, social movements, and the measurement of social capital. He also is pretty prolific. He's the author of 8 books, including We Are the Ones We Have Been Waiting For, The Promise of Civic Renewal in America, and What Should We Do? I want to thank both of them for joining us today and for this really important conversation about not only CRT and the propaganda machine around it, but what we need to do about this and how we need to ensure that all kids have the promise and the potential of public education and have the kind of safe and welcoming environment they need to thrive in the 21st century, particularly in the aftermath of what we've all been through in terms of the last few years. So I'm going to start with Marcia first, if I may, call you by your first names, and get your overall thoughts of what you've seen playing out in these debates and what you think it's really about. And then I'm going to turn to Peter.
Well, I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, Randy, and for your leadership in, being very honest about what's actually happening. So I think that the conversation around the movement against critical race theory is the outgrowth of 2 things. The first one is, if you can imagine and recall 2021, if we think about it in terms of an academic school year, we went from the George Floyd summer that inspired so many institutions to make a commitment to anti-racism. And by the end of the school year, we have this anti-CRT movement. How does it happen so quickly? Well, I think it comes from 2 places. One, the way that the right was able to leverage the critical thinking that came out of the George Floyd summer, whether it was about policing or about more respectful and inclusive education, and they knew how to weaponize them and infuse them into these astroturf movements where all of a sudden parents who may have never really been engaged in curricular issues, parents who never really thought twice about what their kids were being assigned at schools, are all of a sudden foot soldiers against critical race theory. And so I think that this is part of the dirty tricks that the right has always relied on, weaponizing learning, trying to suppress anything that looks like progress in our schools, and then deputizing parents, and I think particularly in a moment of white grievance, to do the dirty work of their campaigns. So there's that. But I think that there's something else that is also instructive about this moment, is the ways in which a lot of school communities made commitments to anti-racism without a really sound plan. And I think that the vulnerability of using the rhetoric of anti-racism as a way to kind of end difficult conversations about student experiences, or thinking, okay, this will be the salve to all of the noise, also, I think, put schools and school leaders in a really bad position, because I think people were making commitments to ideas and approaches that they didn't fully understand. And so now we have to find ourselves reinventing the wheel and going back to the progress that we made in public education in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and trying to have a more inclusive curriculum. And I think that this is an object lesson in the politics of backlash.
So I couldn't agree with you more, but I want to just ask Peter for his first, thoughts about it. I just want to say that, Marcia, I went back to my curriculum, to your point about the backlash. I'm a social studies teacher, Clara Barton High School. Frankly, I'm on leave right now to be the AFT president. And I went back to my own curricular work that I taught in the 1990s. And so much of what I taught in American history would be branded by Rufo in that kind of ideological way. And it is really pushing us backwards to to the opposite of what we need to do in terms of an inclusive curriculum that engages kids in each other's lived experience. And I couldn't agree with you more. Peter, what's your overall thoughts about what you're seeing playing out here?
I want to say I'm moved by your description of yourself as on leave as a social studies teacher. I knew you had been a social studies teacher, but I like the idea that you still are one. Just doing another little public service here. No, so I mean, I certainly agree with the thread of the conversation that you started, Randy, and that Marcia picked up, and you started powerfully with the Rufo quote, which kind of gives away the it just plainly confesses the strategy. I mean, the only thing I would add, and I wonder if you both agree or don't, is there are a lot of committed educators and students as well who are pushing for change. I mean, they're pushing for, and it's probably, Marcia's right, it's not coming out as coordinated strategies, and it's not necessarily coming out as smart strategies, but they are pushing. And in doing so, one would expect pushback because the whole point is to challenge people. And so people are hearing, parents are hearing things that they haven't heard before. If they were parents of Randy's class in New York City in the 1990s, they might have heard it, but parents in Virginia are hearing things, and not to stereotype Virginia, but across the country are hearing things that they haven't heard before. And I think the messages there and the ideas, messages is makes it sound too manipulative, but just the ideas and questions that they're hearing are meant to change society and are going to get, it would be very surprising if parents said, we're being called out to think about anti-racism for the first time, and we're just fine with that. So I don't think it's all artificial. I think Chris Rufo is very skillful. And I think these choices, like calling it CRT, that's a careful choice. There are probably a bunch of reasons why that would poll well. But I also don't think at this point that the answer can be, well, we don't teach CRT in high schools, because it's come to be the name for sort of basically cutting edge anti-racist education, some of which is very powerful, some of which is probably a little misconceived or not strategic. But it's the name for that. And I think part of what we're seeing is backlash that's pretty grassroots driven. That would be, I mean, I guess that's more of a hypothesis than a fact, because I don't really know. But that would be my read. Right. I would expect grassroots reaction. And I think Chris Rufo expected it.
Right. I mean, it's intended, and I think Marcia made a really important point before. Thank you, Peter. But I think Marcia made a really important point before about, on some levels, how ill-prepared school districts and schools are for these tough conversations. You can't just say, we're going to have a tough conversation and then leave it there. We have to be actually skillful in what it means to treat people inclusively and to really deal with and delve into lived experience so that our students feel welcome and safe, and that it's not a matter of buzzwords, it's a matter of, how we operationalize things as well. And so I'm going to get to in a minute or two kind of, what we do about it. But I do want to just make sure that I read one more quote from him, because I want to make sure that I put this out there as well, because it has so much to do, Peter, with what you do in terms of your life and civic education. And this is a quote that Mr. Rufo gave to Michelle Goldberg in the aftermath of the November elections. And I quote, "I've unlocked a new terrain in the culture war and demonstrated a successful strategy. We are right now preparing a strategy of laying siege to the institutions." And in another tweet, he said that means getting rid of school boards, abolishing teacher unions, and abolishing higher education. So we know what the next stage is in terms of what they're trying to do. And Peter, I just want to kind of have you kind of link this to some extent to what you've tried to do over the years about civic engagement and engaging kids in terms of civitas, and how that would actually be a pretty powerful strategy, not only in response to, but proactively to change the dialogue in America.
Right, and of course, the kids, the students themselves are in this story because they've been doing a lot of the pushing, especially on the side of making education more anti-racist. So there actually is civic engagement going on behind the scenes by students, and there may be some on the other side. But I mean, we do. Well, the big picture is we do want to have a society in which we can have powerful, productive, difficult conversations about really hard issues like white supremacy, and include parents in those conversations and include kids, and know how to deal with facts and know how to deal with disagreements and expect disagreements and be able to work through it, all of which is hard to do, but we certainly aren't going to get there if we're not actually even, for example, teaching social studies or civics in high school, or if we're not investing in professional development for teachers or helping or making the standards good. So all the nitty gritty work that it takes to make social studies education work well is very important to do. I mean, one sort of takeoff from what you asked, Randy, is I wouldn't want the takeaway to be we need to get parents out of schools and we need to just leave this to the experienced, the expert educators. I think you want schools to be democratic institutions that are linked to their community, and you want people to participate. So our reaction to the movements in Virginia shouldn't be to say, "Oh, we never wanted parents anywhere near the schools. We didn't want them to know what was being taught. This is terrible. They found out." We want to get through. This is terrible. They found out. We want to get through. It's less susceptible to the sort of divisive but also deliberately misleading tactics that Chris Rufo is practicing.
So that's a really I want to delve into that one too, because I think Marcia kind of set up our conversation for that. And I couldn't agree with you more, Peter. We need parents to be in schools. Parents are our partners, and parents need to have agency in terms of their kids' schooling. Of course, they need to have a say. And in fact, part of democratic governance of local school boards is about making sure that parents have a say and parents are engaged, and that parents are, with teachers, trusted partners of our kids' education. And that's very different than the way in which others, have talked about this. And I think it's important. I think it was a mistake for Terry McAuliffe to say what he said at a debate about parents not having a role or a say. And I think it's important for those of us who are engaged in our kids' education, make it really clear that parents are our partners. But I think this goes back to something that Marcia said at the very beginning, and I want her to dwell on this a little bit more, which is if we could do this all over again in the aftermath of the empathy that was created after George Floyd's murder by a police officer, the empathy about kind of living in each other's shoes, walking in each other's shoes, how do you think we should go about kind of resetting how we teach about diversity and anti-racism and things like that? What would you, top of mind, think we should do as we go into the rest of this school year and next?
This is such a tough one because I think that the political and social climate made this an impossible task in some levels because, the summer, the rhetoric, the pandemic, the attack on public schools, all of the tensions made this impossible. But one of the things I think we needed to distinguish a little clearer, the issues that were coming out of schools and school districts, some were of a interpersonal, disciplinary kind of purview. So racialized bullying, targeting, dynamics within students in schools that did not have the adequate tools to address it. And then we had the curricular issues. And then we had, teachers who were stretched to their absolute limits. And so in many ways, all of these elements and a global pandemic makes it really hard to initiate change. From my perspective, in my work with K through 12 educators around these issues, I always say we want to start in small digestible chunks. We need to pull back sometimes from the language of diversity, equity, inclusion, and start with very small baby steps. How do we make schools safe? How do we make schools comfortable? How do teachers relate to each other? How do we manage conflict? How do we reduce a culture of passive aggressive interactions? How do we gradually change what we're teaching? And so I think sometimes the impulse, and I understand that as an educator myself, we want to do everything at the same moment and go from 0 to 100. But I think most schools, in order to do this work, it has to be incremental. It has to be watered down to its most basic levels. And I think the interaction with parents has to be, what kind of world do you want your kids to exist in? And I think some of the reasons why, schools were unprepared is that some of it was unfinished business from the past. Behavior and actions and events that were really hard to undo because they weren't addressed in the first place. And, I think we all have a role to play. But I will say this, the thing that is different than other moments of backlash in the past, whether it was the culture war of the 90s or the deep reactions in the 1960s to school integration, is that our young people now have a second space of information gathering that has nothing to do with schools. Our young people, through all of the social media platforms, for good and for bad, can now be exposed to really critical and thoughtful analysis and learning that they don't need school to do it. And so their parents' interventions in the school space doesn't foreclose the possibility of their own consciousness raising. And that can be very exciting and can also be a robust place for us to really, be deliberative. But the thing that I am most heartbroken by is the fact that the 4 years where we had President Trump in office, we had a media landscape and an intellectual landscape that suggested that every idea was valuable, that if a person spews hateful garbage, you have to give them a listen. And I think that the confusion about respecting expression and not setting boundaries about expression that is really harmful to the larger culture, I think it's biting everyone in the backside and not setting those boundaries clear enough and having them, run rampant. And so I think we're in a process of undoing. I'm not hopeless that we can get our moral footing, but it's going to take a lot of work. And I think it's going to take a lot of taking responsibility for mistakes in the past.
Right. So that raises, again, I'm so grateful to talk to both of you, but that does actually raise some of the things in these new laws that are in some ways bizarre and a reflection of what you just said, Marcia. And I'm talking about the both sides isms, teach both sides of an issue and not actually be able to discern, fact from fiction. So if either of you were teaching high school social studies right now, what would you say or try to do about these laws that require the teaching of both sides? How would you handle that? Or would you just basically ignore it and wait for there to be, like in New Hampshire, a bounty that, thank God, the governor of New Hampshire, Republican, said that that bounty, condemned that bounty that a very libertarian group called Moms for Liberty created. But what would you do if you were teaching high school right now and somebody told you to teach both sides of the Holocaust or both sides of slavery? How would you deal with it?
I mean, I think one thing is just to say I'm very sympathetic to my colleagues who teach K-12 schools because they have a lot harder job than I do and a lot harder job than they previously did under these conditions. So I don't know if I can really say what they should do. To make an obvious point, but you didn't actually quite explicitly say it, Randy. I mean, some things don't have two sides, and some things have more than two sides also. Right. So I think the two sides idea is also kind of polarizing. It assumes that there's a left and a right side to everything, whereas sometimes there are 14 different sides, and sometimes there's only one side. So that's what's wrong with it. Hopefully, most people will get that, and we'll get past this. I also assume that there'll be some First Amendment challenges to some of these laws. But in the meantime, I mean, the only thing I would say that's constructive, because mostly I'm just saying that it's hard, and I don't know the best strategy to avoid bad laws. But the one thing that I'd say that's constructive is there is a certain value to trying to find issues on which there are at least two good sides in order to learn that kind of skill. So, Randy, you might be mad at me, and we have known each other for a few years, but I actually use school choice in a undergraduate public policy course. I wouldn't have to do an education thing at all. It could be any public policy, but actually do school choice because I think there are a bunch of arguments around that coming from unexpected sort of strange bedfellows and lots of different takes on it. And I choose it for that reason, so that there are sort of two sides, or there are more than two sides, but that you can start it as a binary, school choice or not. And I think that has some pedagogical value. So I guess one thing you might do if you're a teacher is you might actually try to navigate to issues where you think there are two sides. And that's a way into some of the great issues in American life, too, because we do have perennial questions about liberty versus solidarity or equality. We have these deep questions, the role of government. And so maybe that's the answer. I mean, in the laws are bad. They should be fought. If there's a way to subvert them, it's fine with me. But if they're on the books, maybe a part of the solution is actually to identify issues which do kind of have two sides and spend some time on them. So not slavery, but there might be some issues around racial justice that have two sides.
So what I'm hearing you say, and I'm gonna turn this hot potato over to Marcia too. What I hear you saying is that you would say, well, there might be some places issues that are two sides, but there are issues that do not have two sides. The Holocaust does not have two sides. Slavery does not have two sides. And just for everybody who's listening, we have made a commitment to our members that any of these issues, if our members are teaching honest history and they get sanctioned or, bullied or harassed or subject to discipline because of any of this stuff, we as the AFT, we have their back and we will help fight that in any kind of proceeding that we need to fight that in. And that is our obligation and our responsibility to not only our members, but to humanity in general and to a democracy in general and to being, fighting for justice and for opportunity, and opportunity with a justice lens on it. So, Marcia, what would your advice be to take a school district or a school teacher in Texas right now in terms of what they're supposed to do when they're told to teach both sides?
Well, I mean, you can teach both sides. You don't have to necessarily glorify or, you don't have to make both sides an equivalent, right? You can say, here are the people who supported these things, and here are the consequences of that support. Because I think that this is also something that we lose sight of in these conversations. The fantasy that there is all this liberal indoctrination that's happening in schools, and it is happening at the expense of a kind of robust intellectual experience, is one of these ideas that suggests that qualified and thoughtful educators don't know how to teach things, right? So for us to teach about slavery and not to teach students that there were people who were pro-slavery for these myriad of reasons, we would just be doing a bad job. And so I think that this both sides legislation, it's not actually doing anything. What it's saying is it's mandating something that I think is inherent in good teaching. You present a lot of ideas to your students, and you explain the consequences of it, and you explain the ramifications and the long-standing impacts. And, you do all of these things in really quality teaching. I think what these types of policies are trying to do is to suggest that school could be a place to validate the worst impulses of our society. That's really what they're trying to get at. But there's a lot of ways to be compliant with these laws and teach very good history, but that's not the desired outcome. And so I think that this is where we have to help support teachers to be very strategic and be very clear in the classroom as to kind of what they're presenting. And I understand why this creates a lot of anxiety for teachers because, the anecdotes of the teachers and the superintendents and the school boards that are being sanctioned, it's very scary in a profession that is already, requires a lot out of us.
Right. Right.
That's interesting, and that wasn't where my mind went. That's a different answer. I like that. For instance, students should read John C. Calhoun with appropriate context.
100%.
I mean, that would
Exactly
I wouldn't just
right.
without a.
I think that's the part that is also missing in these culture war conversations. Good teachers teach a lot of material, but they don't use it as, for the purposes of hagiography or hero worship. They teach the material and they're able to provide the context and the consequences.
So do you think, I was struck, frankly, when Glenn Youngkin's acceptance speech or victory speech for the governor of Virginia, I was struck when he said that what they're going to do in Virginia schools from here on in is not tell kids what to think, but teach kids how to think. And those words could have come out of my mouth. I think that part of this is this kind of false dichotomy that, clearly, if you talk to virtually every one of my members, we want parents to be involved in our kids' education. And we're going for how kids think, how to help them learn how to think, not to tell them what to think. So my question is, what kind of strategies do either of you think we should be employing or using to recreate a community again between parents and teachers?
Well, what I think is interesting is that the bashing of teachers, that train is always on time, but the bashing of teachers that's happening at the moment where teachers are the most extended is really upsetting to me. So if disagreement over how COVID should have been handled in the public schools wasn't enough, and if Zoom school wasn't enough, and if the childcare crisis wasn't enough, they've added this. They have taken schools at their most vulnerable moment and said, "Oh yeah, and we're going to do this CRT thing too." So I just find it appalling, and I think that the contempt towards public education, particularly, is contempt about people who are imagined to use public systems, and that's Black and brown people and poor white people. So the kind of secondary effect of this type of targeting is also about people who are vilified for not being in positions of having all of the choices in front of them. I'm going to say that first. But how do you rebuild that trust? Well, I mean, I think parents need to have a timeout. I think that having spent the year having to probably be more engaged in their children's education than they usually have to just by virtue of COVID, they should have walked out of this moment with a great deal of respect and a gratitude for teachers. But instead, you see this kind of stuff. I actually don't have a response to this because I'm so upset about it. But I guess the rebuilding of the trust is that teachers, for their part, need to learn how to communicate to parents the long game of their children's education. That we are
Right.
teaching them these difficult topics so that they are better at these very concrete things in the world. We are engaging these conversations because we don't want our schools to be places of harm. Like, I think that some of the kind of bare bones why we do things in schools and why we teach what we teach, I think sometimes we lose that in the education process, in the day-to-day of meeting standards and meeting expectations. I think that reflective part of it has to be part of the conversation with parents and teachers.
So it sounds like, and I'll go to Peter next, but it sounds like, and the reason I'm pushing both of you is because, we're doing a podcast, where all of us can very easily dissect the problem. What I think my members and frankly, I would say parents and other educators are looking for is how do we solve some of these things? Because I think that parents actually, and you see it in terms of what actually happened in these elections in the fall. If you look at Battlepedia, a website that follows politics and elections, they identified 275 school board candidates who took conservative stances or these kind of ideological stances on race, gender, and pandemic issues. And about 25%, 28% of those candidates won those races. So there's lots of people all across the country who actually want schools to be welcoming and safe, understand we've gone through a really tough time, have a lot of respect for their kids' teachers, and we don't want them to feel alone, but we want to build on that kind of sense of community and trying to figure out what to do. And I thought what you just said about the kind of reflection at the beginning of a school year, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it. And having those kind of conversations with parents, I think would probably go a long way and making sure that people had a sense of that long game. Peter, what do you think?
Yeah. So I don't want to romanticize the past because it was worse in many ways. But I think we have lost some um, of a set of traditions and even institutions that allowed parents and other community members to be involved in schools. There are a lot of things. I think the late great Eleanor Ostrom, economist, calculated that less than a third as many people are involved in actually being on school boards as they were in the mid 20th century because of consolidation of schools. But also the mechanisms for things like public engagement are terrible. So often it's, the school board up at the front of the room behind microphones and everybody gets a turn to talk for 30 seconds. And these are lousy methods. We're not good at that kind of thing. Also, PTA membership is down. Other kinds of engagement are down. What's behind my thought is that I'm most worried about the couch potato critic, the person who's tuning in, especially to Fox News, but there's an ideological presumption behind my statement there. So let me just say the person who's sitting there listening to media and forming opinions and just expressing the opinions. And I'm less worried about the person who actually has to take responsibility for managing something with other people. I think that's a form of that brings the real world to your doorstep when you are part of a group that actually has to manage things. And a lot fewer Americans are. We did a survey in which we found that less than 20% of Americans felt that they were part of any group that had sort of real self-governance, where they were involved in the self-governance. And I believe those numbers have gone down in the 20th and 21st century. So I guess I'm always at risk of sounding Pollyanna or nostalgic, and I don't really want to be, but I do still believe that when you get people together to actually make consequential decisions, and they have to do so with people who are differently situated from them, so parents and teachers, or certainly people who are diverse demographically, that they get better at it through practice. And certainly if they're not ever doing that, they get worse at it through practice. And it's very easy to sit there saying the schools are my enemy if you don't have to be responsible for actually making tough decisions, like about COVID. So whether to open or close schools, that was tough in our town of Cambridge, Mass. It was very divisive and bitter kind of struggle. But, that's what running a system is about, is making difficult decisions. And people have very little experience with that because they've been isolated. And then I'll shut up, but one more dimension to it is sometimes some condescension towards that kind of involvement. I mean, sometimes from people I agree with on other issues, I do think sometimes us liberal academic expert types are very condescending towards other people. So for instance, I wouldn't message this as you all are fools. You don't realize that critical race theory isn't taught in schools. I would take them to be actually participating in democracy and objecting to things they don't agree with, but then I would disagree with them about what they're saying.
You two, you probably will not find this to be a really tough question, but I find this to be one of the most sobering things I think about all the time, both as a social studies teacher and now as a union leader, beforehand as a lawyer. Do we think we'll ever get to a time when race and racism doesn't play such a role in our country? Do you think we can ever get to that time? And what can schools actually do to deal with that really, really, really sobering reality? Marcia, I'm going to start with you.
Oh, the teacher's calling on me first for such a tough
yes,
question.
Yes, the teacher. Yes.
I don't know. I don't know. But what I am pretty certain of is that I think the reason why we're in the place that we're at right now is that school is often one of the greatest disruptors of the kind of the families and the communities that we build internally, right? So school is the first time you're going to meet a kid who is different in some way. School is the first time you might have an opportunity to read something from a perspective that is not your own. School is usually the first time that you are able to observe other adults and how they wield power and how they negotiate power. So school has this profound ability to interrupt a kind of thinking and ways of being in the world that I think can be really important. So school can teach children that there is nothing inevitable about the hatred and the racism and the inequality that surrounds them, or school can confirm all of these ideas. And that's the thing that makes this so challenging, but also so hopeful. You know, this I adopted a child this past spring, and I'm now a parent. And now that I am a parent,
God bless you.
thank you. I have a harder and harder time talking to teachers and talking to parents about schools because there is this new level of sadness that I feel when a parent says, my kid was bullied in this school, for being Black. My kid was bullied in the school for being disabled, and no one was listening to me. When I was the expert, I could say, well, here's some ways that we can strategize. And now I think, gosh, can you imagine sending your kid to a place where every day feels like a gut punch? And so I think, ultimately the question is whether or not we are willing to allow our schools to be an extension of our greatest hopes for the world we want to live in, or do we want schools to confirm some of the worst impulses in our society? And I think, as long as we're really stuck in that question of whether we really do want change, whether we're willing to relinquish our own power in order for others to have more, I don't know if I'm going to see it in my lifetime. I don't know if my kid's going to see it in his lifetime, but I do know that school is the place where all of these things can start and where that spark can be ignited.
Thank you. Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I don't expect to see it in my lifetime, and I feel that it would be kind of irresponsible to expect that, or it would be for a middle-aged white man. I mean, I think my expectation should be that we will not, and I don't know about for my kids who are probably older than Marcia's. But I mean, if you want to look for some hope, I guess you could think that the sheer demographic change in America is causing a lot of white anxiety right now, but will get us to a somewhat better place in the well, not to utopia, but to a somewhat better place. And the model for that would be California, where peak hostility to immigration and peak explicit kind of racial politics was at the point where the white majority was at risk of losing its control. And I mean, the reason it's not utopia is because obviously what white supremacy remains. And one of the reasons that things are calmer, I think, in California is that white people realized that they were actually going to be fine. But which means that there wasn't as much social transformation as we might want. But you could imagine that the whole country is where California was in the 1990s, in which case we might be in a better place, that I might live long enough to see us be in a better place, but not utopia, not even close. I mean, it just would be less, it would be basically Donald Trump would be to the United States what Pete Wilson was to California.
So I'm going to end with some good news, and maybe it's because it's the holiday season, or maybe it's because as a school teacher, or I often see things glass half full, not glass half empty. I think with each, I go back to what Dr. Reverend Bishop Barber says. I go back to what President Obama says, that with every piece of progress, we see a backlash, but that at the end of the day in America, the arc has actually tended towards justice, but we have to do it ourselves. We have to actually push that arc. With people like you, Marcia, and people like you, Peter, we are doing that. With people like the amazing teachers in the United States schools, we're doing that. I think that they have been through, this has been the hardest year ever, trying to get through a once-in-a-century pandemic. In the aftermath, or, in a year when we saw Ahmaud Arbery shot by 3 so-called vigilantes, and in a year that we saw George Floyd murdered by police officers, but in a year also when you see, after a terrible incident in Waukesha, Wisconsin, how people pull together to try to save lives. You see both the best and the worst in the same many months, but schools themselves are key to how we either, as Marcia just said, confirm current reality or change things. And when you look at where people are, and I go back to an Axios poll, there's still a lot of confidence that school is a place that we can create a welcome and safe environment. And so in the early November after the election, Axios Ispos asked that question. And overall, both Democrats and Republicans thought that schools did a good job in balancing health and safety with other priorities. And ultimately, if we actually start working with parents again in real ways, where we're reflective, where we have moms clubs, where we actually talk about what we're teaching and why, we see huge majorities thinking that teaching honest history is important. We see decent majorities thinking that schools did a good job in a terrible situation. And ultimately, it's schools where we're going to make sure that kids rise and that kids thrive. And so I end with just basically saying to both of you, thank you so much for helping us kind of get to and unpacking what we need to do in terms of teaching honest history, what we need to do in terms of moving forward. But I still have my bet on the public schools having the promise and potential to help all kids rise and all kids thrive in America. And with that, I want to just ask both of you just for a couple of closing words if you have, and then I'm going to thank both of you for being on this podcast.
I would just use the opportunity to thank the teachers in all sincerity. I do get to work with teachers very often, most times a week. And so I'm not just talking vaguely, abstractly. I know teachers, and I just think it's a very, very tough job, and especially right now. And the levels of hardness are just unbelievable. And so since this is a AFT podcast, I just want to thank the teachers.
And I want to express my gratitude to all the union leaders who are standing up for teachers. And, one of the things I love to teach my students is about how we move towards the common good. And I always use teachers as the example that when teachers take collective action, it isn't just about their own pay. It's about the life and quality of life of their students, whether it's the cost of housing, whether it's mental health care, whether it's making sure that there's school nurses and school psychologists, making sure that, schools are not a militarized space, that we don't just enter public service for ourselves. We really want to think of a larger society. And I can't think of a better example than teachers. So I'm incredibly grateful for all of the leadership that teachers provide all of us. And I can always use as an example to my students about how we look for that bigger picture.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Chatelain, and thank you, Professor Levine, for this incredibly important and frankly raw conversation about how we teach and what we teach and how to move forward in these very, very fraught times. And as always, I thank all of you who are listening to Union Talk. Until next time. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Union Talk. Remember to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast and tune in every other week for a new episode. Thank you, be safe, and be well.